The Iron Guard does not breed kindness, it breeds conquest. Its power is not measured in land or wealth, but in the cold, documented precision of its military meritocracy. A brutal, unyielding machine built on the singular rule, rank is everything. Here, Lyra existed in the shadows, a forgotten ghost whose job was to tend to the vast, dusty, and utterly irrelevant silent archives. She was the lowest rank, an invisible cog whose only value was dusting ancient maps and ensuring the scrolls didn't decay. Knowledge the High Commanders dismissed as useless history. Lyra sought solace in that quiet oblivion, preferring the company of dead kings and forgotten strategies to the suffocating hierarchy of the living. But silence can be deceptive. The capital was tense, buzzing with the restless anxiety of perpetual war. Outside the archive's thick stone walls, the Iron Guard was losing ground, their conventional battle strategies failing against an unpredictable enemy. The highest command was fractured, desperately seeking a solution. Lyra knew the answers were hidden in the forgotten texts around her, specific strategies and ancient logistical secrets deemed archaic by the arrogant modern general staff. Her soul ached with the knowledge that she held the key to saving them all, but to speak meant breaking a sacred rule. Knowledge without rank is treasonous ambition. That tension was about to break. Tonight, the heavy silence of the archives would be shattered by the arrival of the only man in the Guard who mattered, General Kaelen, the Warlord. A man so consumed by the burden of his command and the ghosts of war that he was recklessly searching for clarity anywhere, even in the deepest, dustiest corners of the fortress. Lyra was about to be caught doing the one thing that could save her people, or cost her life. If you're already gripped by Lyra's desperate choice and the high stakes of the Iron Guard's war, give this video a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any part of her fight against the system. And let us know in the comments. If you were Lyra, would you risk everything to share the forbidden knowledge or stay hidden to survive? Now let's see the moment her world changes forever. Chapter 1. The silent archives were usually a realm of cold, peaceful oblivion. But tonight, a new kind of tension vibrated through the air. Lyra was deep within the central chamber, a vast, echoing space where centuries of history lay dormant. She was not dusting the shelves. She was tracing the delicate script of a millennia-old scroll detailing the shorthand maneuvers of the first king. This text was considered heresy by the current Iron Guard, as it emphasized defensive strategy and logistics over aggressive combat, a fatal distraction in their modern conquer-or-die mindset. Lyra had lost herself in the text, whispering the intricate details of the counter-siege tactic of the Forgotten Passes, a strategy that addressed the exact supply line vulnerability currently crippling the Guard. Her voice, normally hushed, resonated slightly in the massive chamber as she recited, "When the steel breaks and the fuel runs low, the true battle is won in the shadow of the rearward roads. Starve the heart, and the blade will dull." The sound of her own voice startled her, but it was too late. The heavy, iron-bound door to the chamber groaned open. A wave of cold, sterile air preceded the figure who entered, General Kaelen, the Warlord of the Iron Guard. He was accompanied by his head guard, Cade, but his presence alone filled the cavernous space. Kaelen was a figure of hard, functional power. His armor was dark and scratched, his expression perpetually strained by exhaustion and the burden of command. He rarely visited the archives, finding history a tedious distraction. Lyra froze, the ancient scroll trembling in her hands. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was not supposed to be reading these texts. She was certainly not supposed to be speaking them aloud. She instantly lowered her head, collapsing into the subservient posture mandated by her rank. Kaelen halted a few paces away. He was not looking at her abject humility. He was looking at the scroll. His cold, assessing gaze cut through the dim light of the archives. What was that strategy? Kaelen's voice was low, deep, and carried the weight of 1,000 battles. The shorthand maneuvers? That text was classified as inert historical data generations ago. Why are you reciting it? Lyra stammered, fearing the immediate consequence, a disciplinary hearing, or worse, dismissal into the dangerous civilian zones. Your Highness, I was simply testing the preservation quality of the script. The words, they were needed to gauge the acoustic resonance of the chamber. It was a ridiculous, desperate lie. Kaelen ignored the excuse. He stepped closer, his presence utterly dominating her space. He was drawn not by her fear, but by the specific content of the words she'd uttered, words that addressed the exact logistical choke point that was currently frustrating his best generals. You were reciting a counter-siege tactic, Kaelen stated flatly, his presence utterly dominating her space. A tactic that addresses the rearward roads. I need to know why, Archivist. Lyra stared at him. She saw the exhaustion and the intense strategic desperation in his eyes, the look of a leader who was drowning in conventional wisdom. She knew this was her single, final chance. If she lied, she would be dismissed into the dangerous civilian zones. If she spoke the truth, she risked immediate execution for insubordination and treasonous arrogance. Her fear was swallowed by a sudden, fierce conviction. The lives of the soldiers outside, the lives of her people, were more important than her low rank. Because, General, she said, her voice now steady, stripped of its former subservience, your current strategic reports all prioritize direct combat, leaving the true vulnerability, the enemy's extended fuel and supply lines, unaddressed. The General Staff ignores this, but history does not. The answer to ending the siege is not more steel, it is starvation. And that strategy is detailed in this scroll. She didn't plead or apologize. She spoke with the cold, clear logic of a master strategist. She had successfully diagnosed the failure of the Iron Guard's meritocracy. Their fatal flaw was their arrogance in ignoring any data that wasn't fresh from the battlefield. Kaelen stared at her, the silence stretching taut between them. He saw not a frightened servant, but an analytical mind untainted by the conventional thinking of his high-ranking council. In her knowledge, he saw not rebellion, but salvation. The exhaustion around his eyes lifted, replaced by a sudden, intense, almost predatory focus. Cade, Kaelen commanded his guard, never breaking eye contact with Lyra. Secure the archives. You will classify this entire chamber as restricted. No one enters and nothing leaves. He then looked back at Lyra, a hint of dangerous pragmatism replacing the desperation in his gaze. You claim competence, Archivist. Competence is the only currency I accept. You have 5 minutes to organize your materials. You will accompany me to the war chamber. Lyra realized the terrible weight of his order. She wasn't being rewarded. She was being conscripted into his highest circle, instantly made responsible for the lives of thousands. Her rank had been ignored, but her knowledge had just been seized. You have risked treason, Archivist, Kaelen concluded, his voice low and final. Now you will justify it with results, or face the consequences of failure. Chapter 2. The transfer from the dusty silence of the archives to the sterile, brightly lit war chamber was jarring. Lyra, still clad in her simple, threadbare archivist's tunic, was presented before the high command of the Iron Guard, a room filled with men and women whose every success was meticulously documented by their rank badges and battle scars. General Kaelen wasted no time on pleasantries. He stood at the head of the massive tactical table, his armor gleaming under the harsh strategic lights. This is Lyra, Kaelen announced, his voice carrying the authority of final decree. Formerly Archivist, effective immediately, she is attached to my personal staff as the confidential stratagem keeper. She will oversee the implementation of the counter-siege tactic of the Forgotten Passes. The reaction was immediate, palpable disdain. Lord Commander Varis, Kaelen's senior officer and political rival, a man whose entire family lineage was interwoven with the Guard's history, rose slowly, his expensive, polished armor clicking softly. Varis saw himself as the only suitable person to influence Kaelen, particularly concerning marriage alliances, and he viewed Lyra as an absurd, dangerous complication. "General," Varis began, his voice dripping with condescension, "with all due respect to the cleanliness of our records, the role of stratagem keeper requires a minimum field rank of colonel, 30 documented years of active service, and verifiable combat experience. This archivist has none of these. Where is her file?" Kaelen placed his hand flatly on the tactical table. "Her file consists of the knowledge she holds. She has identified a fatal flaw in our current strategic doctrine, a flaw that cost us the last 3 supply caravans. Her knowledge of ancient logistics is superior to your current planning, Commander." Varis smiled, a cold, calculated gesture designed to humiliate. "Superior or merely contrarian? We are fighting a modern enemy, General, not a scroll. The meritocracy of the Iron Guard is founded on documented rank. To entrust vital command to someone outside that structure is not strategy, it is reckless sentiment." Lyra felt the weight of every gaze in the room. She was not only facing professional skepticism, she was facing a system whose entire identity was built on excluding her. Varis's accusation, reckless sentiment, was the deepest insult one could level against the Guard's cold, logical foundation. "If the system's documented rank prevents you from seeing the enemy's obvious logistical vulnerability," Lyra stated calmly, stepping forward to meet Varis's gaze, "then perhaps the system, and not the strategy, is flawed, Lord Commander." The sheer audacity of a low-ranked archivist speaking to a Lord Commander ignited immediate fury in Varis. Before he could respond, Kaelen moved. He stepped directly between them, ending the argument with his presence. "Enough," Kaelen ordered. "The results will speak for the system. Lyra, proceed to my private quarters. You will be provided with the current logistical reports and your new assignment. Commander Varis, you will prepare to defend your current supply routes against Lyra's analysis." Kaelen had silenced the debate, but he had not ended the war. He had merely thrown Lyra into the deep end, demanding she sink or swim under the direct, watchful scorn of the Iron Guard establishment. Lyra was escorted out of the war chamber and into the private wing of the General's fortress by Cade, Kaelen's head guard. Her new quarters were stark and functional, designed for strategy rather than comfort. Gone were the dusty scrolls and quiet solitude. In their place was a tactical display console and a severe, practical uniform, the standard issue of Kaelen's senior staff, lacking only the rank badges. Cade, a man whose loyalty was only to Kaelen and efficiency, laid the uniform across the foot of the bed. "The General commands you to wear this. It is a protection of sorts, Archivist. But know this, it is also a target." Lyra picked up the heavy gray and black tunic. It felt like armor and a prison simultaneously. It signified she was under Kaelen's direct protection, but it also cemented her separation from her old, safe life. "Why is he doing this?" Lyra asked Cade, her voice quiet. "He risks the entire structure of the Guard on one civilian's observation." Cade's expression remained impassive. "The General doesn't risk. He calculates. He is desperate for a solution outside the predictable. You saw something they missed. Your knowledge bought you this uniform, but that knowledge now dictates the lives of thousands. The cost of wearing this is simple: success or death. The Guard shows no mercy to failed strategists." The immense weight of that reality, that her simple act of reciting history now carried a death sentence if she failed, crushed the last vestiges of her archivist persona. Moments later, Kaelen arrived. He ignored the tactical console and walked directly to Lyra, his gaze intense. "The war has cost us more than men, Lyra," Kaelen stated, using her name without the formality of her former title. "It has cost us strategic flexibility. My generals are trained to look forward, not backward. You, however, see the patterns of history. Your first assignment is not to plan a charge, but to analyze the past 4 months of our engagements and define the precise moment the enemy began exploiting the rearward roads. I need the truth, unfiltered by rank or political optimism. He pointed to the uniform. That tunic is your shield and your obligation. You have 1 week to deliver a verified strategic counterplan based on the Forgotten Passes tactic. If your plan fails to secure the next major supply caravan, I will be forced to present you to the military tribunal myself, charged with deliberate dissemination of misleading intelligence. Kaelen wasn't asking for loyalty. He was demanding immediate, ruthless competence. He had stripped her of her anonymity and given her a massive burden. The fate of the Iron Guard hinged on her ability to translate ancient theory into modern victory. "Do you understand the weight of this uniform, Lyra?" Kaelen asked. Lyra, holding the heavy fabric, met his gaze. The warmth of the archives was gone. She was now standing in the frigid air of command. "I understand, General. Failure means not just my death, but the failure of your campaign." Kaelen gave a rare, grim nod. "Good. Now, you have lost 5 minutes talking to me. Begin your analysis." Chapter 3. Lyra's week in the war chamber was a relentless gauntlet of intellectual and bureaucratic sabotage. The high-ranking officers, particularly those loyal to Lord Commander Varis, could not openly defy General Kaelen's command, but they could certainly make Lyra's assignment impossible. The Iron Guard's contempt for anyone outside the combat-proven rank structure manifested in calculated attacks. Data withholding. Lyra required current logistical data, fuel reserves, casualty estimates, and troop deployment manifests to apply her ancient strategy. The senior captains, under Varis's silent direction, consistently delivered the reports hours late, riddled with intentional obfuscations, or categorized under incompatible military encryption protocols that only high-ranking officers could instantly navigate. Misleading assignments. During strategy sessions, colonels would pepper Lyra with highly specific, irrelevant questions about obscure battlefield maneuvers, trying to expose her lack of field experience and force her into a mistake that would discredit her in front of Kaelen. Physical isolation. Lyra was constantly left out of informal strategy meetings, with critical updates passed through whispering in corridors or dismissed as too sensitive for an archivist's clearance. One afternoon, a senior logistics major, under the pretense of assistance, assigned Lyra the task of manually calculating the total calorie burn rate for the entire northern flank's reserves, a job that would take a full team days to complete. He handed her the massive, disorganized stack of paperwork, a smirk playing on his lips. "The General needs this verification immediately, Archivist," the major said, his voice laced with patronizing authority. Unless, of course, the shorthand maneuvers include a faster way to count rations. Lyra felt the crushing pressure of the deliberate delay. She knew this was a test designed to waste her precious time and ensure she missed Kaelen's 1-week deadline. Failure here wouldn't just be professional. It would be interpreted as confirmation that non-military personnel were incompetent burdens. She didn't react with anger. She applied her archivist's mind. Lyra spent 2 hours ignoring the numbers, instead focusing on the structure of the manifest. She realized the paper reports were organized chronologically, but the digital reports, which she could only access through a restricted terminal, were organized by unit designation. She found the only way to beat them was to exploit the very system they relied on. She used her archival knowledge to write a short, archaic indexing algorithm, a skill taught in the ancient libraries to manage massive, decentralized data, and fed it into the restricted terminal. In seconds, the machine reorganized the entire paper manifesto digitally, instantly revealing the correct calorie burn rate and, more importantly, exposing a pattern in the major's documentation that suggested deliberate over-reporting of consumption. When the major returned, expecting to find her paralyzed by the math, she handed him the concise, correct report. "The calorie burn rate is 7.2% below projection, Major," Lyra stated calmly. More concerningly, the consumption reports from the 3rd and 7th Regiment camps show logistical duplication, a flaw that suggests either incompetence in reporting or intentional misallocation of resources. Which is it? The major paled, stammering a defense. Lyra hadn't just passed the test, she had reversed the interrogation, demonstrating that her useless knowledge of organizational structure was a far greater weapon than their conventional battlefield math. Kaelen, observing the exchange from a hidden monitor, gave a subtle, satisfied nod. The archivist had survived the first wave. Lyra survived the sabotage, but the clock was ticking down on her 1-week deadline. Retreating to her quarters, she ignored the confusing, heavily encrypted current battle maps and focused on the only thing she truly trusted: the patterns of history. She took the sparse, geographically separated data on the current enemy positions, which the generals were using to calculate troop placement, and overlaid it with the ancient resource maps from the silent archives. These maps detailed not only terrain, but also historical migration routes, ancient water sources, and, most crucially, the seasonal limitations of the surrounding territories. The Iron Guard generals were trained to assume enemy movement was dictated by rapid combat superiority and fuel supply. Lyra knew from the scrolls that the enemy they faced, tribal mercenaries operating in the region for centuries, would never rely on such fragile logistics. By cross-referencing the seasonal drought cycles, recorded in the archival weather logs, with the enemy's current rapid advance, documented in the Guard reports, Lyra saw the flaw. The enemy was not advancing randomly. They were moving along an ancient concealed salt trade route that guaranteed them access to hidden, sustainable water sources, allowing them to bypass the Guard's heavily monitored main roads. More damningly, Lyra's knowledge of the shorthand maneuvers confirmed the logistics. The salt route, while securing their water, was impossibly narrow at one specific choke point: the Twin Peaks Pass. Lyra rushed to the war chamber, where General Kaelen was reviewing casualty reports, his face grim. She pointed directly at the map, ignoring the main battle lines entirely and tracing a fragile, forgotten line far to the east. "General, the enemy is not where your current projections estimate," Lyra stated, her voice shaking slightly with excitement and conviction. "They are not advancing on the northern flank to attack our steelworks. They are using the ancient salt route to circle our defense, securing their water supply, and are preparing to cut off our main food and fuel conduit at the Twin Peaks Pass." Kaelen leaned over the map, his eyes narrowed, scrutinizing the line she drew, a line that had no place on the modern military projection. "That route is impassable for siege gear," Varis scoffed, having followed Lyra into the room. "Pure archival fantasy, General." "It is impassable for siege gear," Lyra conceded, looking directly at Varis, "but not for their light, fast-moving transport. And if they control that pass, we don't need siege gear. We need rations. Your doctrine assumes direct force. History proves that logistics win the war." Lyra presented her final evidence: the logistical schematics from the ancient scrolls, overlaid perfectly on the modern satellite topography. The alignment was undeniable. Kaelen looked from the map to Varis's furious, panicked face, and finally to Lyra. The evidence was irrefutable. Lyra hadn't just proven the ancient tactic was relevant. She had saved their entire supply chain, proving that the Iron Guard's meritocracy was blind to the very weaknesses it created by ignoring low-status knowledge. Kaelen issued his command immediately. "Dispatch the 5th and 7th Regiments, not to engage, but to fortify the Twin Peaks Pass. Use the shorthand maneuvers for their deployment, now." Lyra had not only survived her first week, she had earned her place, shattering the General Staff's complacency with the silent power of a book. Chapter 4. The success at the Twin Peaks Pass silenced the immediate public scorn of the War Council. Lyra's theory, that the enemy was vulnerable to logistical starvation, proved chillingly accurate, forcing a decisive, if temporary, retreat by the opposing forces. The victory validated Kaelen's unprecedented choice, cementing Lyra's position as an essential, if unofficial, strategic asset. However, the war within the fortress was far from over. Lord Commander Varis merely retreated from open confrontation, his disdain turning into calculated, dangerous observation. The victory did little to ease General Kaelen's perpetual exhaustion. Though his political decision was vindicated, the sleepless nights, haunted by the faces of casualties and the unending demand for command, persisted. His generals offered predictable advice. Lyra offered something different. It began subtly. Kaelen would summon Lyra to his private office late at night, long after the War Council had dispersed, usually around the second hour of the moon cycle. He wouldn't ask her for immediate tactics. Instead, he would present a strategic problem, an upcoming negotiation, a political dilemma, or a complex troop rotation, and ask her to analyze its historical equivalent. "The enemy commander is known for using the tactic of the scorched earth, Lyra," Kaelen asked one night, leaning back in his chair, his eyes strained. "The official reports state we should meet that destruction with overwhelming force. What does the history say?" Lyra, now comfortable in her practical uniform and in the silent power of her intellect, would retrieve a specific archival reference. "The history says the scorched earth tactic is a mask, General. It implies retreat, but it is always used to slow and starve the pursuer. The true intention is to consolidate power through attrition. The answer is not overwhelming force, but patience, cutting off the supply of the land, forcing him to turn back into his own barren territory." As Lyra spoke, tracing patterns on an ancient, stylized map, Kaelen would simply listen. Her voice, calm and precise, grounded the chaotic reality of the present in the logical, predictable patterns of the past. Her analysis was completely devoid of personal ambition, fear, or political posturing, qualities his senior staff could never separate from their advice. For Kaelen, Lyra's presence became the only genuine reprieve from his relentless command. He slept better when he knew her logical mind had already factored in the worst-case scenarios, proving that even the most chaotic conflict adhered to ancient, measurable laws. It was not affection that grew, but a desperate strategic reliance. Lyra, in turn, saw past the Warlord's harsh exterior. She saw a man trapped by the rank he held, exhausted by the necessity of constant ruthlessness, and desperately seeking a clear moral anchor, a truth that transcended the necessity of military action. Their bond deepened through the weight of this shared late-night burden. Lyra provided the clarity. Kaelen provided the protection needed to speak it. The late-night strategy sessions began to shift from historical analysis to moral confrontation. Lyra, protected by the sheer necessity of her intellect, felt empowered to challenge Kaelen on the very foundation of his command, a challenge none of his high-ranking officers would dare attempt. One evening, after analyzing a siege strategy that guaranteed victory but required the calculated starvation of a border town, Kaelen moved to authorize the deployment. "The logic is sound, Lyra," Kaelen stated, signing the order with ruthless efficiency. "The Iron Guard will secure the northern border, and the war moves closer to conclusion. Casualties are acceptable." Lyra placed her hand on the deployment map, stopping him. "The logic of the strategy is sound, General, but the logic of the cost is flawed." Kaelen paused, his gaze hardening. "Explain your insubordination, Archivist. Cost is calculated in steel and attrition. I have the data." "Cost is calculated in memory," Lyra countered softly, her eyes holding his. "Your strategists look at that border town as a necessary casualty on a projection graph. I have read the histories of that town. I know their founding charters, their traditional alliances, and the famine they survived 2 centuries ago. They are not resources to be spent. They are citizens to be saved." She continued, her voice quiet but firm, forcing him to see the human detail his rank deliberately shielded him from. "The ancient texts you value taught that a true victory is not merely a cessation of conflict, but the establishment of sustainable peace. The starvation of that town will create generations of bitterness and future rebels. You win the battle, General, but you guarantee the next war." Kaelen pushed back from the table, rising to his full, imposing height. He was accustomed to deference, not moral indictment. "You speak with the sentiment of a scholar, Lyra, not a commander. Sentiment does not hold a fortress against an invading army. No, Lyra agreed, standing her ground. But sustainable logic does. If we use the counter-siege tactic to cut off the enemy's logistics further north, the point of least civilian impact, we achieve the same result without turning our own citizens into future enemies. The logic of history demands we choose the most efficient path, and the most efficient path is the one that avoids unnecessary moral debt. She was not appealing to his heart. She was appealing to his pragmatism, using his own standard of efficiency against him. Kaelen stared at her, absorbing the challenge. His jaw was tight. His commanders only worried about their rank and their immediate gain. Lyra worried about the long-term solvency of the kingdom's soul. He realized the logic of her argument was terrifyingly sound. After a long moment, Kaelen slowly picked up the signed deployment order and tore it in half. "Draw up the revised deployment for the Northern Pass," he commanded, his voice measured. "Show me the strategic advantage of sustainability." The moral debt of command, which had driven his insomnia, had found its accountant. He had needed a weapon to win the war, but he had found a conscience to save his command. He had begun to trust Lyra's judgment, a bond built not on attraction, but on the profound mutual respect for a logic that transcended military rank. Chapter 5. Lord Commander Varis had watched Lyra's success with cold fury. The victory at Twin Peaks was bad enough, but Kaelen's torn deployment order, based on Lyra's moral logic, was an unforgivable insult to the Iron Guard's tradition and to Varys's claim to power. Varis realized Lyra was not a mere inconvenience. She was a paradigm shift that had to be eliminated. Varis knew he couldn't challenge Lyra on logistics anymore. He had to hit Kaelen where he was most vulnerable, the speed and precision of his command. Varis activated a secret network of officers loyal to his family and the traditional hierarchy. Using his deep access into the Guard's encryption protocols, he began a devastating campaign of subtle disinformation targeting the ancient strategy protocols Lyra relied upon. His plan was twofold. 1. The planting. Varis meticulously altered the encrypted timestamps on a series of archived historical reports. He modified the documents Lyra frequently cross-referenced, making it appear that a key ancient strategy, the three-point defensive wedge, was implemented after a major historical defeat, rather than before a victory, as Lyra's analysis suggested. 2. The setup. Varis then publicly pushed for an aggressive, high-risk flanking maneuver that Kaelen was hesitant to approve. He knew Lyra would review the plan and, relying on her corrupted historical data, would correctly advise against the move, recommending a defensive posture based on the flawed three-point defensive wedge timing. The following morning, Kaelen presented the flanking maneuver to his small council, watching Lyra expectantly. Lyra, having spent the night analyzing the historical precedents and cross-referencing her archives, was certain. "General, the flanking maneuver is too aggressive. It exposes our central forces exactly as the enemy desires. History proves that the optimal time for a defensive posture is now. We must implement the three-point defensive wedge to absorb their initial strike before advancing." Kaelen listened, frowning slightly, relying on the strategic insight that had saved them before. He ordered the flanking maneuver cancelled and implemented Lyra's defensive strategy. Varis, who had only been present to observe the trap, permitted himself a faint, predatory smile. He had his confession. That evening, the enemy forces, acting on Varys's accurate, unsabotaged intel of Kaelen's real plans, launched a devastating, fast-moving counterattack directly against the flank that was now vulnerable due to Lyra's defensive recommendation. The attack was a major, costly setback for the Iron Guard, costing them a strategically vital outpost and dozens of men. Varis immediately went to Kaelen, not with a formal accusation, but with a look of devastated sympathy. "General, I have just received the field reports. The loss is devastating. I took the liberty of reviewing Archivist Lyra's historical sources, and I found the error. The three-point defensive wedge was not implemented as a prelude to victory, but after a crippling defeat, as a desperate measure. Her data was flawed. He presented the timestamp evidence, perfectly forged, that directly implicated Lyra's council as the cause of the disaster. Varis had ensured that the failure was not just strategic, but personal, isolating Lyra as the single point of failure in Kaelen's judgment. The war chamber was thrown into chaos. The loss of the strategically vital outpost was a devastating blow, and the high-ranking officers who had only ever resented Lyra now had concrete proof, signed off by Lord Commander Varis, that her useless history was responsible for the blood spilled. General Kaelen stood over the tactical map, his face a mask of cold, unreadable fury. His gaze swept from the reports of the disastrous setback to the perfectly forged data presented by Varis. He had staked his considerable authority and the lives of his men on Lyra's unconventional intellect, and it appeared she had failed him catastrophically. Varis pressed his advantage, playing the role of the loyal, heartbroken officer. General, her initial success was built on predictable logistical data, but history, unchecked by military context, is chaos. She has proven herself a danger. She must be removed before the military tribunal demands a formal inquiry into your judgment. Kaelen knew the danger Varis presented. If the tribunal smelled weakness or political turmoil, Varis would be the first to capitalize. He had to act immediately, brutally, and decisively to maintain control of the command structure, even if it meant sacrificing the one person who offered him clarity. Kaelen looked up and spotted Lyra standing near the console, her face pale with shock and confusion as she realized the depth of the betrayal. "Cade!" Kaelen barked, his voice ringing with cold command. "Confine Archivist Lyra immediately, secure all her materials, and seal her quarters. She is to be held for formal inquiry on charges of gross strategic incompetence and endangering the Iron Guard." Cade, Kaelen's head guard, moved instantly. He gave Lyra a look of deep, reluctant regret, but protocol was absolute. As two guards moved to confine her, the high-ranking officers watched with grim satisfaction. The system had corrected itself. The low-ranking trespasser was being purged. Lyra did not struggle. She understood the political necessity of Kaelen's move, but she had to deliver the single, vital piece of information that proved the attack was personal, not merely strategic. As the guards escorted her away, Lyra looked back at Kaelen, meeting his cold, pained gaze across the width of the war chamber. "General!" she called out, her voice clear despite her fear. The three-point defensive wedge was implemented using current troop numbers, which were correct. The failure was caused by an enemy movement that only Varis and his immediate flank knew we had ruled out. The enemy knew our plan because they were told we were not flanking. That information was not in the silent archives, General. Lyra's desperate claim, pointing out that the failure required leaked current operational data, not flawed historical data, slammed into Kaelen with the force of a weapon. Varis had not simply found a mistake. He had created a tactical window using highly sensitive, restricted plans. Kaelen's expression remained rigid, but his internal calculations spun violently. Lyra had provided a devastating truth, a truth that confirmed her innocence while simultaneously revealing Varis as a political traitor who was actively compromising the Iron Guard's security for personal gain. "Take her!" Kaelen finally commanded, his voice tight. As Lyra was led away in utter public disgrace, Varis approached Kaelen with feigned sympathy. "A regrettable but necessary action, General. Now, we must restore order before the tribunal." Kaelen ignored Varis. His eyes were fixed on the tactical map, the battle lines now blurring with the lines of political allegiance. He had arrested the only person he trusted, but in doing so, he had received the undeniable evidence he needed. He was now alone, facing a trusted subordinate who had just proven himself a dangerous enemy. Chapter 6. The military tribunal was convened the next morning, a formal, intimidating assembly designed to uphold the rigid laws of the Iron Guard's meritocracy. The room was packed with high-ranking officers and nobles, all eager to witness the official downfall of Lyra, and by extension, the strategic failure of General Kaelen. Lord Commander Varis, presiding over the hearing with an air of somber duty, sat at the head of the table. Lyra, dressed in her rough prison garments, stood confined between two guards, her face pale but her expression composed. Varis began by presenting the evidence. The forged timestamp records proving Lyra's flawed historical analysis, coupled with the devastating loss of the outpost directly resulting from her defensive recommendation. "The evidence is clear," Varis stated, his voice ringing with false regret. Archivist Lyra, driven by arrogant ambition, disseminated misleading intelligence, leading to preventable casualties. She must be stripped of her rank, or what little she had, and faced with the full charge of military negligence. When it came time for the defense, the room waited for Kaelen's trusted lawyer to step forward. Instead, General Kaelen himself rose from his seat and walked to the center of the chamber, taking the floor. "I will present the defense," Kaelen announced, his voice carrying an unwavering authority that silenced the room. "And I will present the new evidence." Kaelen ignored Varis's furious glance and addressed the tribunal members directly. The archivist's initial crime was using inert historical data to predict a future event. Varis's charge is that this prediction was flawed. But Lyra, in the moment of her arrest, provided a crucial piece of counter-evidence. Kaelen pulled up the tactical map on the central display, showing the precise location of the enemy's successful counterattack. The enemy knew exactly where to strike because they knew we were not flanking. That counterattack required access to our current, high-level, restricted deployment plans, the plans that were cancelled based on Lyra's advice. He then projected a secure audit log, data that only he, Varis, and Lyra had ever handled. Lyra's initial analysis contained no current data, yet the information required to coordinate the enemy's counterattack was leaked from this very council. I submit that the person who provided the evidence of Lyra's flaw, Lord Commander Varis, is the only officer who simultaneously benefited from her mistake and possessed the crucial operational data required to turn a strategic error into a military disaster. Varis leaped from his seat, his face scarlet. "Treason! This is insubordination, General. You are accusing me based on a civilian's desperate lie." "I am accusing you based on logistical impossibility," Kaelen stated coldly, turning his full, relentless gaze onto Varis. "The true crime is not Lyra's reliance on flawed history, but your deliberate sabotage of the Iron Guard for personal political gain, which is the definition of treason." Kaelen produced the final piece of evidence, a small encrypted data slate proving Varis had been diverting Guard resources through shell companies, a vulnerability Lyra's archival indexing had first hinted at when she exposed the logistician's over-reporting in Chapter 3. The tribunal was thrown into chaos. Kaelen hadn't come to defend Lyra's past work. He had come to expose Varis's present treachery using the clarity Lyra had taught him. He had used the official hearing not as a trial, but as a clean public execution of Varis's political career. "The tribunal may uphold its charge of technical negligence against Archivist Lyra," Kaelen concluded, his voice ringing with victory. "But the charge of treason against Lord Commander Varis is undeniable. I demand his immediate arrest." The military tribunal was in an uproar, but General Kaelen's authority was absolute. The evidence against Varis, financial records coupled with tactical incompetence that only a traitor could engineer, was irrefutable. Varis's desperate appeal to tradition and rank was met only with the cold reality of the data. Kaelen nodded to Head Guard Cade, who immediately moved to confine Lord Commander Varis, stripping him of his armor and rank badges right there on the tribunal floor. The symbolic act was a devastating blow to the established military elite. Once Varis was removed, Kaelen turned back to the remaining high-ranking officers, who sat stunned, their loyalty to the established system fundamentally shaken. "The Iron Guard's meritocracy demands justice," Kaelen stated, his voice resonating with finality. "Justice requires competence, and competence requires unfiltered clarity. The system you all relied upon was flawed because it deliberately excluded the truth for the comfort of rank. It failed because it bred treachery instead of ingenuity. Kaelen then looked at Lyra, who stood silently, the humiliation of her prison garments now irrelevant compared to the magnitude of the truth she had upheld. He walked over to her, his shadow falling over her small frame, and personally ordered the guards to release her. Archivist Lyra was charged with gross strategic incompetence, Kaelen announced to the tribunal. That charge is now nullified. Her use of historical data, though risky, was based on integrity, which the guard clearly lacked. Her subsequent analysis was the only thing that exposed the treason within this room. He paused, letting the full weight of his next decree settle upon the silent room. He was not making a political alliance. He was declaring a new law. Effective immediately, the role of confidential stratagem keeper is made permanent and elevated to the rank of chief strategist, a position that requires no battlefield experience, only absolute intellectual honesty and clarity. And effective immediately, that rank is granted to Lyra. Kaelen turned to Lyra, his eyes reflecting a deep, mutual respect that transcended any romantic sentiment. He was claiming her not as a mistress or a political wife, but as his equal partner in command. Lyra, Kaelen said, his voice softer now, addressed only to her. You have proven that the only true asset of the Iron Guard is truth, regardless of the rank that speaks it. I command the Guard, but I rely on your insight to keep the command true. He reached out and placed his hand over hers, a gesture of shared burden, not ownership. By claiming Lyra, the low-born archivist, as his official strategic partner and equal, Kaelen shattered the core of the Iron Guard's meritocracy. He redefined the Guard's concept of merit, proving that intellectual competence could override birthright, wealth, and battlefield rank. The tribunal had watched him sacrifice his chief commander and his political ease to secure a single, invaluable asset, the truth held by the most overlooked person in the kingdom. The threat of Lord Commander Varis was eliminated, the rigid hierarchy was permanently cracked, and the Warlord of the Iron Guard had found the clarity he desperately needed in the Keeper of the Silent Archives. The Epilogue. 5 years passed. The upheaval that followed the execution of Lord Commander Varis and the shocking elevation of Lyra, the former archivist, was immense. The older, rigid command structure was deeply resistant to change, but General Kaelen's authority, backed by Lyra's indisputable strategic victories, was absolute. The Iron Guard, known for its brutal adherence to rank, began its slow, painful transformation. Lyra, now holding the permanent high-ranking office of Chief Strategist and Keeper of Clarity, fundamentally rewrote the Guard's meritocracy. Rank was no longer solely based on documented time in service or inherited bloodline. A new tier of advancement was established based on verifiable intellectual contribution, allowing officers who possessed strategic insight, regardless of their combat background, to rise swiftly. The Silent Archives, once forgotten, became the central hub of strategic training, proving that history was the ultimate weapon. The political bond between Lyra and Kaelen deepened into an unbreakable partnership, cemented not by romantic declaration, but by the relentless shared responsibility of command. Kaelen learned to trust Lyra's moral logic completely, finding that sustainable peace was indeed more strategically efficient than endless conquest. One crisp autumn morning, Kaelen found Lyra not in the war chamber, but in the newly restored Silent Archives, overseeing the integration of new recruits, young, low-ranked soldiers and clerks, who were now actively studying ancient tactics. The northern campaigns are complete, Kaelen stated, his voice now devoid of its former tension. We've signed the treaty using your negotiated terms. No more unnecessary casualties. The war is over. Lyra looked up at him, a rare, peaceful smile crossing her face. The Guard is safe, General. But the war against arrogance never ends. The new recruits are learning to respect the data, not just the uniform. Kaelen walked over and stood beside her, his dark armored frame contrasting sharply with the dusty academic setting. He didn't use the formality of her title. "They credit you with teaching the Iron Guard how to truly see, Lyra," he said. "They say the warlord who ignored rank found the only person who could save his army. They talk of marriage alliances." Lyra met his gaze, the quiet intelligence in her eyes unchanged. "The only alliance that matters, General, is the one that saved the Guard. You command the power, and I provide the clarity. We are a stable, functional unit. Why introduce unnecessary chaos?" Kaelen reached out and gently brushed a piece of dust from her shoulder, a silent, intimate acknowledgement of their shared history. "Chaos is inefficient, Chief Strategist. But history also dictates that all successful partnerships must eventually solidify their foundation to secure the future." He didn't ask her to be his wife. He proposed a final, high-stakes, strategic move. Lyra considered him for a long moment, seeing the man who had risked everything for her truth. "A necessary measure, then," she conceded, returning his gaze with a promise of enduring commitment. "But no banners, General, and the marriage charter must state clearly that the chief strategist's word overrides tradition." Kaelen gave a rare, genuine smile, a smile of true peace earned through sacrifice. "The rules are yours to write, Lyra. The only rule that stands is the rule of clarity and integrity." The partnership, built on intellectual merit and tested by betrayal, was now the unshakable foundation of the entire kingdom. The low-ranked archivist, whose only defense was the truth of history, had permanently redefined the meaning of rank, bringing enduring stability to the volatile heart of the Iron Guard.